The rain came down hard that evening, drumming on the windshield of George Miller's old pickup as he drove the winding dirt road that led home. The sky over the Montana hills was the color of steel, and the scent of wet pine filled the air. George leaned closer to the wheel, squinting through the wipers. He'd seen H.S. Shari of Storm during H.S. 68 years, but something about this one felt linear than most. A flash of movement caught H.S. A small shape had would be wiser at sight, barely visible in the wash of H.S. headlights. He slowed the truck, hard, totting. It wasn't trash or a fallen branch. It moved. George stopped, opened the door, and the cold hit him like a slap. The rain sucked through H.S. jacket in seconds. He crouched beside the little creature, and one H.S. flashlight found H.S. breath coat. A Bobcat Cub, no bigger than a house cat, fair-mattered, trembling violently. Its eyes, wild and desperate, met H.S. for a single fragile moment. "Well, now," George whispered, voice cracking. "What are you doing out here? All alone, little feller?" The cub hissed weakly, but didn't run. It was too tired, too cold. George slipped off H.S. flannel shirt and ripped it around the animal, careful not to startle it. The small body quivered against H.S. chest, its heartbeat frantic and fragile. He could feel it fighting to stay alive. "Easy," he murmured, holding it close. "We got you." When he climbed back into the truck, the Bobcat gave a faint mull, the sound almost human. George turned up the heater, stealing glances at H.S. passenger as he drove. The storm swallowed the road behind them, and for a moment it felt as if the rest of the world had vanished. At home, the porch light flickered in the wind. Inside, by the fire lay Mag, Georgie's old German shepherd, loyal, protective, and sharp as ever. When the door creaked open, Mag lifted H.S. head, ears pricking. "Boy," George said softly, "you've got company." The moment Mag caught the scent, he stood up, stiff-like, hackles rising. H.S. deep bark filled the cabin, echoing off the wooden walls. The Bobcat Cub stared in Georgie's arms, frightened again. "Easy, Mag. It's just a baby." George closed the door quickly, shielding the cub. "Look at him. He's not red." But Mag didn't see a helpless cub. He saw an intruder, a wild thing. H.S. growl rumbled low, steady, ancient. George placed the cub on a folded blanket near the fire, keeping a weary eye on Mag. The dog pissed once, twice, then stopped. H.S. body tensy, eyes locked on the little bundle. "Mag," George said quietly, "you remember what Mama said to tell us? We don't turn away from something that needs help." Mag flicked an ear, still watching. George sighed and sat down beside the fire, stretching. H.S. searching knees. He poured some warm milk into a bowl, then slid it out the cup. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tiny creature lifted its head and began to drink. Weakly at first, then faster. George smiled, the lines on H.S. face deepening. "That's it. You're safe now." The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting a golden glare across the old man's face. He leaned back in H.S. chair, listening to the rain and the faint sound of the tubes breathing. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel empty. It had been a quiet life since H.S. wife passed. The days stretched long. Coffee at sunrise. Chores, the same old news humming from the radio. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too hard, George would talk to Mag just to fill the silence. The old dog always listened, VHS Brown is kind and patient. Now, watching Mach and the Bobcat share the same firelight, George felt something stirring in his chest, a strong mix of fear and hope. Could this oiled creature really belong here? Later that night, he set a small basket beside the hearth and lined it with towels. The cup caroled. Inside, exhausted, George checked its breathing. 10. Patted Mach's head. I know what you're thinking, boy, he whispered. This honest trouble. But maybe we both need a little trouble to remain as here. Still alive. Mach grunted as if in protest and laid down facing the fire. VHS never left the basket. Hours passed. The steam outside grew wilder. 10 slowly began to fade. When George walked near down, the rain hit. Stopped. The fire was dying, its last embers glowing faintly. Something felt different. He turned and froze. Mach was no longer by the hearth. He was lying across the drafty doorway, VHS way, stretched wide, blocking the cold air that slipped in from under the door. And, nestled against HAS belly, heave hidden. In HAS thick fur was the Bobcat Cub. Fast asleep. George stared for a long moment, the corners of HAS eyes stinging. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile that only old souls know. Would you look at that? He murmured. Didn't take long, did it? The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across the cabin floor. Outside, the forest seemed gently alive again. After the storm. Inside, by the dying fire, 2 hearts, one oiled, one wakeful, beat softly in the same. Archotechem Ergi reached for a smoke, took a sip of cold coffee, and whispered to no one. In particular, there is still good left in this world, even if you have to drive through a storm to find it. As he watched Teram sleep, a thought first flickered in HAS mind. He hadn't chosen this encounter. Life had sent it. And, deep down he sensed it wasn't just about saving the cup. Maybe in some quiet way. The little creature had been sent to save him, too. He stood, adjusted the blanket round the basket, and looked out the window at the clearing skies. Somewhere out there, a new day was beginning. And George Miller, or retired, alone, and still searching for purpose, found himself whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. In that moment, with the smell of rain and pain still in the air, he didn't know this was only the beginning of something that would change all their lives forever. The morning broke pale and quiet after the storm. The kind of stillness that follows a long night of wind and thunder. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open window as George poured himself a cup of coffee. He moved carefully. HAS knees didn't like the cold anymore, but there was a little more lightness in HAS step that day. When he turned toward the hearth, the sight nearly made him lay out loud. Mach was still on the floor, sprawled across the doorway like a silent sentry, and right against HAS chest, tucked into HAS thick coat, was the tiny bobcat. The suit's paws twitched, now and then, dreaming of something only wild things know. Well, E.B. and George whispered, shaking HAS. Hit. Yovegoni, soft, old boy too. Mach's ears flicked at the sound of HAS voice. He lifted HAS head slowly, eyes sleepy but alert. When he noticed the cup move, HAS muscles tightened for just a second and then relaxation. The dog let out a deep breath, almost a sigh, before resting HAS muzzle back down. George knelt beside Teram, the flower, creaking under HAS weight. He brushed a gentle hint over Mach's fur, feeling the old scorch that ran along HAS side from the fire last year. You've got a big heart, he said quietly, bigger than most folks ever met. He reached for the kettle, poured our milk into a bowl, and slid a tea across the floor. The cup sniffed the air, blinked its bright eyes open, and, after a hesitant pause, pattered toward the bowl. The soft slurping sound filled the small cabin. Mag watched, tail thumping once, slow and heavy. George, chocked. Guess you're officially running. A bed and breakfast for wildlife now. The morning unfolded gently. George cleaned the little anisphere with a damp cloth, untangling bits of moss and leaves. He could see the faint marks on its legs, scratches from brambles, maybe. Worse. It have to take a tea to town. Soon. Let Dagmary take a look. When he stepped outside to fetch more wood, the sky had cleared into that crisp blue. Come that only Montana seems to know. The mountains glistened with snow on their peaks, and from the trees came the faint cawls of ravens. He took a deep breath, feeling the ache in his chest easy a little, but when he came back inside, there had changed. Mach was standing now, stiff and alert. BCS tail up, BCS gazi locked on the Bobcat. The cub, belly full and warm, was wandering round curiously, and at the rook, at the legs of the old rocking chair. It looked so small beside the shepherd's towering frame. Easy, Mag. George said carefully, setting down the firewood. Is just explain. Mag. Gave a rumble from each throat, a sound not of aggression, but warning. The cub froze, confused. George moved closer, palms open. No one is going to hurt you, he said softly. The same way he used to talk to frightened rescues back in the shelter days. But, 10, without warning, the cub made a tiny leap, playful, innocent, nothing more than a pounds of curiosity. Mag barked sharp and deep, and the cub tumbled backward, frightened. Etty scrambled under the old table. Tail puffed, eyes wide. Mag, thats. Enough. Georgie's voice echoed through the cabin. The dog froze misstep, ears drooping at the tone. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock. 10. George sighed, rubbing his temples. You two are going to give me gray hair, I don't even have left. He crouched near the table and whispered, Come on out, little Vanto. He didn't mean it. The cub blinked at him from the shadows. Still trembling. George waited, patient. As always, until the small form crept out again. He scooped it up gently, holding it close until its heart beat. Slot. See, Mag, no harm done. The shepherd larged his head, shame in his chest. Ace. George recognized that look. It was the same expression Mag had worn after the fire when they lost the pups. He felt that old pain twist inside him. He sat down heavily in his chair, the cup still in his arms. You're both lost. In your own ways, he murmured. Maybe. This is how we heal. Higher. Mag came closer tentatively. He sniffed the suits. Felt in the old flannel blanket. A deep breath in, a long sigh out, and 10. Slowly, carefully, he laid down at Georgie's feet, his head resting near the man's boots. The cub stared at him for a long moment before curling up again. No longer afraid. That evening, George called Dagmary on the landline. One of those rotary phones that seemed to belong to another century. Her voice came crackling through the line. You thought, George, she laughed. A Bobcat. You sure it's not just a funnel looking tabby? I'm sure, he said, smiling. This one is got a titty. Well, bring ATB white Mara. I give AT a check-up, but keep that shepherd off. Yours come tonight. Don't want a wrestling match in your living room. George promised he would, though he wasn't entirely sure he could. He hung up, poured himself a glass of warm milk, that stirs orders ever since VHS blood. Pressure is here last year, and set back. Be wise a fire. As the flames danced, he looked between Mach and the cup. You too might just be the others per the salt. Sabines ever seen, he said softly. But somehow you fit. He thought of his wife. Again, how she said to say, every lost soul finds its mirror. Maybe that's what this was. A broken man, a grieving dog, and a wild little heart. Trying to survive. Outside, the rain had left puddles that mirrored the moon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its CRY long and lonesome. The cub stirred, its ears twitching, but Mach didn't move. He was awake now, truly. Awake, watching, guarding. George could feel it, too. The invisible line that had formed between the the protector, and the protected. He didn't know how long it would last or what kind of trouble it might bring, but for the first time in years, the house felt alive again. Before turning in, he whispered, "Good night, Mach. Good night, little one. Let's make tomorrow a better day." The fire crackled low, and the scent of pain smoke filled the room. Outside, a cold wind swept through the valley, carrying with it a promise that nothing in life, not even the wild, stays unchanged for long. Night came down like a blanket of quiet over the valley. The world outside Georgie's cabin was still wet from the dice rain, the pine trees glistening beneath a sky full of broken clouds. Inside the fire burned low, trying soft orange light against the walls. George moved about the small kitchen, feeding himself a modest soup from a can, a slice of bread, and a handful of blueberries from the morning's basket. It placed a saucer of warm milk near the hearth, where the Bobcat Cub had curled up once again in VHS old flannel shirt. Mach lay a feet away, VHS had resting on HS paws. Ace never leaving the little vandal. Looks like we made a tea through another day, George said loud, HS voice. Feeling the silence, he wasn't talking to anyone in particular, though both pairs of ears twitched at the sound. That's more than some folks can say. The cabin creaked with the slow settling of wood, and from somewhere deep in the forest came the soft hoot of an owl. George carried HA's bowl to the table and sat the giants in HA's hand searching us. The warmth of the soup spread through him. He thought again of Mary, the vet, and her promise to stop be white Mara. Maybe she'd know what to feed a bobcat. That wasn't milk in prayer. As he ate, VHS drifted toward the window. The storm clouds were pulling back, revealing a shy sliver of moonlight. Everything shimmered. Wet earth, the tin roof, even the puddles that had gathered under the old cedar tree. It looked like the world had been washed clean. When George stood to stoke the fire, Mach rose it, too. The shepherd stretched, BHS, old bones popping, and pattered toward the window. A growl vibrated in HA's chest. George froze, one hand still on the poker. What is it, boy? Mach's gaze was fixed outside toward the line of trees beyond the fence. George followed HSA's, but saw only darkness. The growl deepened, soft, but steady, a warning. Then faintly came another sound, a CRY. Not human, but not quite well either. Long and sharp, carried on the wind. The Bobcat Cub lifted its head, ears twitching, body trembling. A teammate a small broken chirp in return, a sound of resignation. Georgie's heart sank. Ah, body, you think that's your mama, don't you? He pulled on HA's coat and stepped outside with a flashlight. The air was sharp and cold enough to sting HA's lungs. The beam cut through the dark, revealing only the ghostly shapes of the forest. Nothing moved yet that CRY came. Again, finter this time, and Tiangoni. Guess whoever that was has moved on. He said quietly, letting the light. Or, maybe it was just the wind. When he came back in, the cub was pacing near the door, tail flicking. Mach stood between it and the threshold like a sentry. Unmoving. George sighed. She's gone. Little one. Time to rest. He poured another bit of milk, and the cub drank. Tau its ears kept swiveling toward the window. Afterward, it wandered closer to Mach, pausing only when the shepherd lifted each ear's head. The rays met oiled gold against the brown, and something wilders passed between them. The night deepened. George settled into Pich's armor with an old book, Tau he barely read a page. Pich's eyes kept drifting toward the two animals by the fire. Mach had lain down again, Pich's great head resting on Pich's paws. The bobcat crept forward step by careful. Step until it was close enough to feel the warmth from Pich's body. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Mach shifted slightly, just enough to leave a space beside him. The cub took it, hesitant at first, then sure, curling against its chest like it had always belonged that the Ergi watched, which is hard to fall for words. You've got the right of it, old boy. He whispered. Sometimes you just need someone breathing beside you to remember her. The world's not all bad. He set the book aside and checked the wood stuff before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Murmuries crept in. Murmuries of H.S. wife humming in the kitchen, of Mach's later years ago, of the night the barn caught fire, and how they had lost almost everything. He could still hear Mach's desperate cries, smell the smoke, feel the helplessness. He turned on H.S. side, facing the glare from the fire. The side that met him made H.S. breath catch. Mach lay heave. Caroled round the cub, the two of the arm. Breathing in the same slow RHYTHM. The Bobcat's tiny paw rested on the shepherd's muzzle. Would you look at that? George murmured. The oil tent. The loyal keeping each other warmed. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe trouble, maybe peace. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. The quiet comfort of belonging. The wind outside my aunt against the eaves, and the moonlight shifted across the floor. George drifted to sleep at last, the last thing he heard being the faint sound of the tube spur, soft and steady, blending with the slow, deep breathing of the dog. In the middle of the night, a crack of thunder echoed somewhere far off. The cub startled. Awake, a frightened squeak sleeping out. Mach lifted H.S. head, looked at it for a moment, and then, just like that, Lord H.S. hit again beside the corpse, pressing close until the trembling stopped. When the dawn crept in, pale and golden, George awoke to the sound of gentle snoring. Two different RHYTHMS, perfectly out of SONC, but somehow harmonious. He smiled before even opening H.S. eyes. Guess you two figured things out while I was dreaming, he said, sitting up slowly. He poured himself coffee, black and strong, and leaned by the window. Outside, the first light touched the wet hills, turning everything to silver. He felt the deep ache in H.S. chest again. But this time it wasn't from loneliness. It was gratitude. Sometimes healing doesn't come from doctors or pills or all those singer health plans they keep advertising on the radio. Sometimes healing walks right into your life on 4 paws, one old, one new, and carols. Up by your fire. George turned, looking at the two sleeping shapes by the heart. Welcome home, little one, he whispered. Looks like you found the right place after all. And for the first time in a long while, the old cabin didn't feel like a place where life had ended. It felt like where it might just be beginning again. The morning sun broke across the valley in long, pale bands of gold. 18 mist clung to the treetops as George led it. The old pickup, the same rocket, driven since the 1980s. Mach sat patiently in the passenger seat, while the little Bobcat Cub, now named Rusty, after the color of each sphere, nestled in a cardboard box lined with one of George's sweaters. Don't you give Duck Mary a hard time, George muttered, adjusting the blanket. She's got sharper eyes than any of us. The drive into town took nearly 40 minutes, winding through a fields washed clean by wiser storm. George loved this road. It carried echoes of a simpler time before Bill sent back chase and long evenings with only the sound of the clock for company. As he drove, the cab picked its head over the box, waddied and couriers, while Mach kept a steady watch, tail occasionally brushing against the gearshaft. When they finally pulled up outside Mary Evans' veterinary clinic, the wooden sign creaked in the wind. George smiled. Same peeling paint, same smell of pine, disinfectant. He carried the box inside, and the warm bell above the door chimed softly. Well, if it isn't my favorite old Thorby, Mary said, stepping out from the back. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat braid, her face lined but kind. And you've brought me a mystery guest. Found him by the road after the storm, George explained. Is it drinking, but I figured you should give him a once over. Marilyn it over the box, and her expression softened immediately. Whispered to the cab. You've hit a restart, haven't you? She reached a careful hint in, and Rusty sniffed her fingers before curling closer to the sweater. George watched quietly while Mary examined the cup, checking its eyes, teeth, and paws. She hummed the way she always did when concentrating. Something soft and familiar that made every nervous animal still. Is dehydrated but stable, she finally said, straightening. Maybe 5 or 6 weeks old. You did good, George. If you hadn't stopped that night, he wouldn't have made it. George rubbed the back of each neck. Guess I still got a bit of rescue left in me. Mary smiled, but then turned toward Mach, who'd been waiting near the counter, ever the gentleman. She crouched and scratched each ears, and was my favorite hero. At the word hero, Georgie's chest tightened. He hadn't told her everything. How Mach had once saved him from the fire that took him each barn, or how the dog had lost each litter in that same blaze. The memory burned even now, though the scars had faded. Mary seemed to sense it. She looked up, her eyes soft. You still think about that night, don't you? George nodded slowly. Every time I smell sucker. Grief's a funny thing, Mary said, sitting back on her heels. We think it's gone, but it just waits. Quiet, patient, until something reminds us. She glanced toward Rusty. Maybe that's WHO you found him, or WHY Mach needed him. George frowned gently. What do you mean? She stood, brushing her hands on her apron. Animals grieve there. Too, George. You saw it yourself. After the fire, Mach stopped eating. Remember her? You told me it just lies there for hours. I remember her. Well, she said, nodding toward the box. Sometimes, healing shows up in unexpected fear. That little one might be exactly what he needed. George looked at Mach, then at Rusty, and, for the first time, the pieces began to fit together. The shepherd had lost each pops. The bobcat had lost each mother. Two broken hearts finding warmth in the same place. Mary handed him a small bottle of vitamins. Mihai dropped VCHS milk twice a day. When is stronger, we can start him on soft meat. You need to be careful. When he gets older, tau instinct doesn't disappear just because you give him a name. George nodded. I keep him close. I owe him that much. As he was about to leave, Mary called after him. George. He turned one hand on the door. Don't let that big dog off. Yours fool you, she said, smiling. Is got a heart that still wants to protect something. Maybe this time it won't break. The ride home was quiet. The cub slept most of the way, curled against the sweater, while Mach leaned VCS hit against Georgie's shoulder, a habit from long drives back one day. We set to work search and rescue. Every bump in the road felt like an old memory, softening at BY time. One day, reached the cabin, the afternoon sun hit, painted the hills in amber. George, carried Rusty inside and set him down near the heart. Mach followed, circling. Once before lying beside the box, VCS, tail sweeping gently across the floorboards. George knelt beside Tearam. You know, he said softly, the chairs. Right. You're not just taking care of him, are you? Is taking care of you, too. Mach looked up, ears twitching at the sound of Georgie's voice, VCS's voice. And steady, met Georgie's with something that felt close to understanding. That night, the three of Tearam sat together by the fire. George poured himself a glass of warm milk instead of whiskey. HES doctor had warned him often enough about HES blood pressure and heart health and listened to the soft crackle of burning wood. Rusty stirred in VCS sleep, a tiny paw stretching toward Mach. The dog responded by shifting closer, VCS heavy tail brushing against the suit's side. Funny how life works, George murmured. You spent years thinking you read only with love, and 1080 sneaks back in the form of fur and whiskers. He leaned back, ace. He closed, the firelight dancing across the room. Outside, snow began to drift again, soft as bread. A tissy trot on the old wooden fence and the empty rocking chair on the porch. Silent witnesses to a new chapter beginning. Inside, George knew it isn't over yet. Raising a wild animal isn't exactly in the singer living it or any retirement plan he had ever read about. But as he watched Mach and Rusty sleep, their breathing slow and synchronized, he realized that what had begun as an act of rescue had turned into something deep, something that looked a lot like purpose. He smiled faintly. Looks like I'm back in the business of saving lives, he said. And somewhere in that cabin, between the crackling of the fire and the steady hum of companionship, an old man's grief finally began to loosen its hold. The weather changed a without warning, as it often does in the Montana hills. One morning, the sky was a shade of soft blue, the air crisp and light. And by afternoon, the wind had turned mean, howling through the trees, tossing DRY leaves in swirling tantrums across Georgie's porch. He had lived long enough to know what that meant. Another storm was coming. He set his coffee down, stepping out to secure the tool shed door. Clouds rolled in from the west, low and dark, heavy as iron. The spell of rain, cold, metallic, hung in the air. Inside the cabin, Mach pissed by the window while Rusty prowled curiously. VCS oiled ace following every flicker of light. Settle down, both of you, George said, forcing a smile. It's just weather. Nothing we haven't handled before. He had no way of knowing that before the night was through, the storm would test Tearam in ways none of Tearam expected. By dusk, the wind had grown fierce, rattling the shutters like angry fists. The radio crackled out a storm warning. Strong ghosts and considerable flooding near the foothills. Residents advised to stay indoors. George turned the volume down, glancing at Mag. You heard her, partner? No. Here walks night. The fire burned bright, painting their faces in gold and amber. Rusty sat close to the heart, now twice the size it been when George found him. Each fair shimmered in the light, and the faint stripes along which his back were more defined. Now, he was still small for a bobcat, but wildness lived in his posture. The way which his tail flicked, the sharpness in his gaze. Outside, thunder grumbled over the valley, followed by a flash that lit the cabin in a ghostly white. Mag barked once, and uncertain. Rusty's ears fluttered. Then came the smell of ozone, sharp, electric, and the rain fell all at once. Sheets of water hammered the roof. The lights flickered, then went out. Well, ain't that just perfect, George muttered. He found his flashlight, its beam cutting a path through the dark. All right, let's make this place tight. You've done this dance before. He checked the windows, stuffed an old tower ladder. The drafty door. The storm was lowered enough now that he had to raise his voice. Mag, keep an eye on him. But when he turned, Mag was already standing, guard in front of Rusty, ears perked, muscles stout. George smiled faintly. Good boy. It just finished lighting a lantern when a sound cut through the storm. A sound that didn't belong. A la growl deep and long coming from outside the back wall of the cabin. A teasing thunder. Mag stiffened, his body going still as stone. Rusty's fear bristled. Tail puffing. The growl came again. Closer this time. Georgie's heart picked up. He grabbed his coat and the old rifle from behind the door. Stay, he ordered, though his voice trembled slightly. He cricked the door open and stepped out into the storm. The wind slapped him in the face, the rain cold and relentless. The flashlight beam swept across the yard. Nothing. 10, near the train, a pyro face glowed yellow in the dark. Too low for a bear. Too wide for a fox. Coyote, George whispered. No, beggar. He knew that shape. A wolf forlorn, gaunt. Disparity likely pushed out from its pack by hunger. Go on, he shouted into the storm. Get out of here. The wolf didn't move. Riti took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then behind George, he heard the door creak open. Mag, no. But it was too late. The shepherd burst into the yard, barking with a fury that shook the rain. Rusty darted out behind him. Before George could grab him, the little bobcat let out a sharp wild sigh. Defiance, fear, everything all at once. The wolf lunged. The yard plunged into chase. Mahmet iti Adon, Tidbert, BCS bark swallowed by thunder. George fired a warning shot into the air, the sound tearing through the wind, but neither animal flinched. The wolf snapped, Mag countered. And then George saw Rusty charging forward, tiny and fearless. Rusty, no. The tub's small body collided with the wolf's flank, buying Mag a split second to clamp down on its shoulder. The wolf yelped, twisting, trying to shake the arm. But off. The scene blurred in the rain. Movement, sound, and the metallic scent of blood. George dropped the rifle and waited forward, shouting until his throat hurt. He grabbed a shovel from the porch and swung at once hard, striking the ground. Beside the wood wolf, the creature jerked back, snarled one last time, and fled into the storm, vanishing into the black trees. Silence returned slowly, broken only by the rain, and Georgie's ragged breathing. Mag was on the ground, chest heaving, dark. Pace spreading on his shoulder. Rusty stood beside him, drenched and trembling, eyes wide. No, no, no. George whispered, falling to his knees. He pressed his hands over Max's, and, feeling the warm, sticky blood. Hold on, boy. You're all right. You're all right. Max's tail moved faintly, a reassuring tap against Georgie's boot. Rusty crouched low, looking at the dog's muzzle, making soft choughing sounds. Comfort, arpeggio, love. George tore his flannel into strips, wrapping the wound as best he could. Stay with me, Mach. Don't you dare give up now. His voice cricket, the storm swallowing his words. They might it back inside, sucked in. Shaking, George laid Mach down by the fire, covering him with every blanket he could find. Rusty refused to leave his side, curling against him, eyes never closing. The room smelled of wet fur and smoke. George sat back, exhausted, staring into the flames. He whispered prayers he hadn't said since he was a young man. Simple words, clumsy, but honest. He didn't care who heard. The storm raged for hours, beating against the cabin, trying to get in. But inside, there was only quiet now. The steady, fragile sound of Mach's breathing and the soft, rhythmic purr of the little bobcat that refused to leave him. Be down, the worst had passed. The wind had died, leaving behind a heavy stillness. George stepped outside, there littered with broken branches and mud. He looked toward the forest where the wolf had fled and whispered, "You won't come back. Not while you're still standing." When he returned inside, Mach opened one. A weak, but alive. George let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest all night. "You did. Good boy," he said softly. "You saved us again." Rusty climbed onto Mach's back, pressing close as if to protect him now. George smiled through the tears in his tired eyes. "Guess you're the guardian now, her." The fire crackled. The rain dripped from the eaves, and for the first time since the storm began, George allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the three of them would see another sunrise together. The storm had passed, but the world outside still wore its bruises. Falling branches littered the yard. Puddles glimmered like shards of glass, and the air carried that sweet, heavy scent of wet pain. Inside the cabin, time had slowed to a crawl. The fire crackled swiftly, and every sound, the drip from the eaves, the steady ticking of the old wall clock, felt louder in the hush that followed the chase. Mach lay stretched out near the heart, wrapped in an old quilt, which his breathing was shallow but steady. The wound on his shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged, and George checked it every hour as if his own life depended on it. Rusty hadn't left his side once. The little bobcat curled against the shepherd's ribs, with his small body rising and falling. With Mach's breaths, George poured hot water into a basin, wrung out a towel, and wiped the dried mud from Mach's paws. "You stubborn fool," he said softly. "Could have been killed. You know that." Mach's tail gave the faintest thump on the floor required acknowledgement. George smiled, though which his eyes burned. "Yeah, I know you do it again." He stood slowly, his back creaking, and shuffled to the kitchen. There on the counter sat a note from Doc. Mary. She'd driven up that morning, bringing antibiotics and a firm lecture about not playing cowboy. George had promised it'd keep Mach warm. And still, though both of them knew that was easier said than done. The smell of chicken broth filled the cabin as he ladled some into a bowl. "Singer meal. Plan for heroes," he muttered, setting I near Max nas. The dog didn't move. At first, but Rusty did. The little Bobcat sniffed the air, then said HES. Paw to nudge the ball closer to Mach. Almost like he understood. Would you look at that? George whispered, voice thick with emotion. Is taking care of you now. Hours slipped by. The light outside shifted from gold to grey as another. Rain began. This one soft and harmless. George sat in HES chair, the blanket over HES knees, watching the two off. Tom. Rusty licked gently at the bandage, HES tongue moving in. Slow, careful strokes. Mach didn't flinch. If anything, HES eyes closed a little tighter, should be wise emotion. George reached for HES cup of tea, the kind marketed on TV as year he out for seniors. He choked to himself. Guess I should song those commercials, he murmured. Keeps me come through all. As when the fire dimmed, he added. Another look, ten setback, lost in thought. The room glowed with that kind of peace that only comes after fear. Fragile, but real. He thought about the years behind him, about all the people and animals that had come and gone. There was a time when he believed the world didn't have much left to offer him. But now, looking at Mach and Rusty, one old, one oiled, both scared, and still standing, he felt a quiet stirring of fate. The next morning, the sun broke through. For the first time in days, birds returned to the fence line, shaking water from their wings. George opened the front door and breathed deep. The air smelled like renewal. When he turned back, he found Rusty trying to drag one of Mach's toys, a freight rope ball, across the floor. The sight made him out loud. Well, that's a good sign, he said. Yenergas back. He crouched beside Mach, rubbing HES head gently. Hear that, partner? You're not done yet. Duck Mary. Arrived later that afternoon, her pickup splattered with mud. She stepped into the cabin, her eyes softening when she saw the scene before her. Now that, she said, is worth keeping. She knelt to check Mach's wound, healing nicely. She murmured, You did good, George. I had help, he said, nodding toward Rusty. The Bobcat was sitting on the hearth, watching her every move. Mary smiled. Well, you've got yourself a nurse 10, and not a bad one. Rusty blinked almost proudly. Mach gefeila, groaned as if agreeing. Keep him on toes. Antibiotics, Mary continued, standing up. And make sure you both got some rest. You look about ready to fall over yourself. I'm fine, George lied. HES back act. HES says were gritty, but HES heart HES. Heart felt younger again. That evening, as Mara struck disappeared down the road, George said. Outside on the porch with a blanket around HES shoulders. Rusty prowled near the steps, chasing a stray leaf that danced in the wind. Mach lay just inside the doorway, HES hit resting where he could still see there, but the word was come again. The storm hit, cleaned everything, leaving behind a sense of fragility. George looked up at the sky, where pink and orange clouds flied there like brush strokes across the fading blue. You did good, old friend, he whispered. Both of you. One night came, he lit the oil lamp and read from one of HES old books. Something about kindness and the quiet courage of simple souls. HES voice trembled, but the words filled the room like prayer. Rusty climbed into HES lap halfway through, pressing HES small hit against Georgie's chest. Mach shifted closer, HES warm body leaning against Georgie's legs. The three of them sat that way for a long while, surrounded by firelight and peace. As sleep crept in, George thought of how strong and beautiful life could be. How love doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes it's a dog with scars. And a wild cub with too much fight in him. Sometimes it's the way a lonely old man finds himself smiling again for no reason at all. Before turning out the light, he whispered softly. You saw each other, didn't you? Mach's tail thumped once against the floor. Rusty part la and steady, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire. And in that cabin on the edge of the Montana woods, healing didn't come with medicine or miracles. It came with trust, warmth, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. Spring came slow to the Montana hills. That year, the snow melted in streaks, leaving behind patches of green that grew thicker each day. The sound of water running down from the mountains filled the air, and the word smelled of mud and pine sap and secret chances. Inside Georgie's cabin, life had found a artificial again. Mach's wound had long healed, leaving only a faint scar under his fur. He walked a little slower now, but there was pride in which his step, like a soldier back from battle. Rusty, once a trembling cub, had grown lean and strong. As Bitch's paws were larger, Bitch's movements graceful, but Bitch's a still softened. Whenever George spoke or Mach would get Bitch's tail. Each morning, George would sit on the porch with Bitch's coffee while the two of them explored the yard. Mach would sniff the fence line next to the wind, while Rusty darted through the grass, chasing books or rolling in the sunlight. More than once, George caught himself laughing out loud, a sound he hadn't made in years. Never thought it'd be raising a bobcat. It's a shaking his head. Guess, Leafy's got a way of surprising you. Hey. One particular morning, he noticed something new. Rusty had dragged one of Mach's old toys, a rope ball, out of the corner and dropped it at the shepherd's paws. Mach looked down, confused for a second, then picked it up and tossed it gently across the yard. Rusty bounded it after it, pouncing with clumsy joy. Would you look at that? George, chocolate, fetch, but make it wild. The game became a routine. Every evening, as the sun dipped low, the two would play, while George watched from Bitch's rocking chair, a blanket over Bitch's knees, and a smile tugging at Bitch's weathered face. The sound of laughter, if animals could, filled the air. Then came the day. The word found out about Teram. It started with a knock on the door. George opened it to find a young couple standing there, both bundled in hiking jackets and grinning ear to ear. Sir, I hope you're not intruding, the woman said. We were driving by and saw something incredible down the road. George blinked. You mean the bear tracks? No, sir. The dog and the well. We think it's a bobcat. They were playing by the creek. Before he could answer, Mach and Rusty appeared from behind the cabin, still dumb from the water, chasing each other in circles. The couple gasped, pulling out their phones. That's amazing, the man said. Do you mind if we record a bit? George shrugged, he foremost. As long as you don't scare him. A week later, Mary shot up with her phone in hand, laughing as she climbed out of her truck. Your femurs, George. Femurs? She handed him the screen. On it was a video titled Dog and Bobcat, Our Best Friends in Montana, posted by the same couple. It had already been shared thousands of times. For heavens sake, George muttered, but the smile that crept across his face betrayed him. Never thought it'd be in one of those feel-good stories. People need stories like this, Mary said. Remains term that kindness still exists. Maybe you'll start a whole movement. Adopt don't fear. George chocolate laured na the internet scene. Worse. Over the next few weeks, strangers started sending letters, some Handwritten, some printed from email. Addressed simply to the man with the Bobcat. They came from as far as Texas. And mine from widows, veterans. Retirees, folks who sat watching that video made term believing good again. One letter written in shaky penmanship. Said, I lost my husband. Last year. I thought it never smile. Again, but seeing Mach and Rusty made me. CRY a good kind of tears. Thank you. George read 80 twice, 10 folded 80. Carefully, setting 80 in the old cigar box where he kept things worth. Remembering. That night, as the wind rose through the pines outside, he sat by the fire with Mach snoring at his feet and Rusty perched on the windowsill. Guess you've done something right, Haya? He said softly. Rusty turned his head, blinking slowly. In that satlicky way that felt almost like agreement. A few days later, a journalist from a wildlife magazine stopped by. She brought a camera crew, Politi and Igor. George hesitated at first, but one day asked if they could record a short segment. He finally agreed. As the camera rolled, he spoke plainly. I didn't plan on any of this, he said. Found him by the side of the road one night. Mach here. He wasn't too happy about it at first, but I guess we all needed something to care about again. The article went viral within days. Donations poured into the local animal shelter in Georgie's name. Doug Mary joked that should have to rename the clinic Rusty's Rescue Fund. George didn't care much for fame. What mattered was seeing the two of them together. Howard had built a family out of laws. Sometimes on quiet afternoons, it catch Rusty lying beside Mach, grooming the old duckers while Mach pretended not to enjoy it. Other times, he'd brought Carol up beside him on the porch as the sun went down, the kind of peaceful silence only found after surviving storm. One evening, as he watched them share a meal, Mach patiently letting Rusty take the first bite. George shook his head. You're something special. You know that, he said, if there is such a thing as emotional support animals, you two are mine. He leaned back, the sound of crickets rising round him. The word was softer. Now, gentler. The scars were still there, of course, on Mac's shoulder, in Georgie's heart, maybe even in Rusty's wild days. But they no longer shared. He turned into reminders of survival, of trust, of our love. Sometimes walks in on our paws when you least expect it. George took a slow breath and whispered, aren't we? Mac's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. Rusty midly paused and looked up, his golden eyes glowing in the fading light. Then, as if to answer, the little Bobcat pressed his head against Georgie's knee. The old man smiled. Yeah, he said, softly, a strong one, but a good one. The fireflies came out then, blinking, like stars come down to rest among them. The word was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hummed with life. For the first time in years, George didn't feel like a man waiting for something to end. He felt like a man beginning again. Autumn returned quietly, painting the Montana hills in gold and rust. The air grew thin and cool again, the kind that carried the smell of pine needles and wood smoke. George felt it in his bones. The changing season, the slowing RHYTHM of everything. Life had settled into a soft, steady, routine, simple and peaceful, the kind of life it stopped believing it ever find again. Most mornings started the same way. George brewed his coffee, Mach stretched by the door, and Rusty waited by the window for the sun to rise over the ridge. The three of them would sit on the porch, watching the fog lift from the valley. The stillness never felt empty anymore. It felt earned. One particular evening, the sky was unlike anything George had seen all year. A. Blaze of a orange and pink bleeding into A. Deep purple horizon. The light shimmert across the wet grass, catching the slow drift of falling leaves. He stood there a long while, resting on the porch rail, feeling the breeze lift his hair. Behind him, Mach walked out slowly, his steps careful, deliberate. The old shepherd's muzzle. He turned almost white now, but his eyes were the same deep brown heat. Always been loyal, gentle, steady. Rusty followed close behind, no longer a cub, but not quite full-grown, either. His coat gleamed under the setting sun. His every movement smooth and strong. Come here, boys, George said softly, lowering himself into the rocking chair. Let's watch this one together. They sat side by side, the man, the dog, and the wild cat, as the sky began its slow surrender tonight. The word felt as respected, as if time had paused just long enough to let them take it all in. You know, George said after a while, when I first brought you home, Rusty, I didn't think this would work. Figure it, nature hit its way, and it ended up pushing both of you back together. He choked under his breath, but I was wrong. Turns out sometimes the wild doesn't need taming. It just needs a little kindness. Mach shifted, resting his head on Georgie's boot. Rusty climbed up onto the porch rail, his tail flicking lazily as he watched the last light fade. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his old phone. He still wasn't much for technology, but Mary had insisted he keep it for emergencies, she'd said. Now, he used it for something else. He lifted it and snapped a photo. So the two of them in the glow of the sunset, their silhouettes outlined by firelight and fading day. The picture came out a little blurry but perfect still. It's on way. He sent it to Mary with a simple message. You're still here. The reply came a few minutes later. That's good, George. The world needs you three. Round. He smiled, setting the phone aside. The fireflies were coming out. Now, their soft light mingling with the last shimmer of the sun. You remember, Mach, he said quietly, how she said to sit right there every evening, same spot, waiting for me to come back from the fields. He pointed to the empty chair beside him. Should be laughing at me right now, seeing I finally went and got myself a family. Again, BHS voice wavered, but there was the sadness in it, just the deep kind of peace that follows a long, hard road. Rusty leaped down from the railing and brushed against Mach's side. The shepherd sighed, a low, content sound. The Bobcat rested his hit against Mach's shoulder, the same way he hit that first night so long ago. George felt his throat tighten. It is, he whispered. It's the picture I keep forever. As the air cooled, he stood slowly and threw another look onto the fire pit. Sparks drifted up into the dusk like small souls finding their way home. He turned back toward the porch where Mach and Rusty were now caroled together. He said again, leaning back in his chair. You know, I've spent a lifetime thinking. Broken things, he said softly. Broken fences, broken engines, broken hearts. But this time it was different. This time it was you two who hit me. A long pause followed. The word round. Term was quiet except for the soft hum of crickets and the rustle of wind through the panes. George closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire touch his face. He thought about how it all began. The rain, there outside, the trembling cub, looking up at him with frightened eyes. And then he thought about what it became. Laughter, healing, and a kind of love that didn't ask for words. Funny thing about life, he murmured. You spent half of it trying to make sense of it, and the other half realizing it doesn't need to make sense at all. The last sliver of sun dipped below the ridge, and the valley sank into that golden quiet that only comes once a day. Mach stirred slightly, pressing his head against Georgie's boot. One final time before settling again. Rusty's breathing slowed beside him, a steady, gentle architecture. George took a slow, deep breath. "Good night, boys," he said softly. "You've done your part. Now rest easy." He leaned back, as he closed the light from the fire, dancing across his face. Inside the cabin, the old clock ticked on buttered BY time. And there, on that porch, in the fading light, 3 souls who had once been lost found the past had been searching for all along. The next morning, Mary came by early. She found George in his chair, the coffee pot warm, the fire out, and the 2 animals carolled at his feet. The look on his face was calm, almost smiling. She stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging gently at her coat. "Goodbye, old friend," she whispered. She knelt and stroked Mach's hair, who raised his head slightly, weary but loyal as ever. Rusty sat upright beside him, watching her with bright, steady eyes. When she looked up again, the sunrise was spilling across the valley, painting everything gold once more. Later that week, she told the story at the local diner. How George Miller, the quiet old man from the hills, had passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the only family he had left. And by the end of her telling, there wasn't a DRY in the room. The photo it sent her the night before, the one of Mach and Rusty against the sunset, was printed and hanging for clinic, friend, with the words it written beneath it. "The of times never last. But love, if you give it a chance, dies." Out on the ridge, Mach and Rusty still came to the porch every evening. The dog lay in his usual spot, the Bobcat beside him watching the horizon. The light would fade, and somewhere in the quiet, the sound of an old man's laughter seemed to echo faintly through the pines. And if you stood there long enough, you'd swear you could still hear his voice, gentle and full of warmth, saying what he always said: "Takes a storm to remind you what really matters. And sometimes that storm leads you home." If this story touched your heart, drop a simple one in the comments to let us know you felt it too. Your support means the world to us. It keeps these true tales of love, loss, and secret chances for life. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more heartwarming stories just like this one. Here is listener story waiting, and you don't want to miss the next.